So welcome to the lecture on motivation. Um, so we're making the complete shift now from the I side of personnel psychology into the O side of organizational psychology. We're moving on from talking about organizational structure, which kind of draws on both, and that's why I like to kind of put it between the two as the transition, kind of looking at the big picture that if you really want to affect large-scale change in organizational development, you need to incorporate interventions and treatments that are both I side, focused on personnel, performance management, performance measurement, and training, but also I side, the human factor side, if you will, or human relation side, I should say. So as always, make sure that you're keeping up with the assignments, and let's start talking about motivation. So motivation in the workplace is the first major subject we're going to talk about as far as the organizational side. Again, more focused on the people and more focused on people within an organization. So if there's two broad things that distinguish organizational psychology from personnel psychology, is that organizational psychology is more focused on the interactions or the social nature of the workplace. So how people interact with each other, how people motivate each other, how people feel about organizations, how people feel about working in groups and teams, how to do leadership. So it's all very focused on kind of the social aspect of performance in an organization. And it's also mainly focused on the inside of the organization, the throughputs. So organizational psychology is a little bit more interested in what do you do with people once you already have them in the organization. Now this still strongly connects to the I side. So if we think about job analysis and the essential components of a job, Campbell suggested that the essential components of any job was task knowledge, skill knowledge, effort, and maintenance. So that effort and maintenance component of any job is a little harder to measure. It's pretty easy to measure if someone has the tasks and skills necessary to do a job. But what we want to know is once they're in the organization, how do we make sure they put up the effort and they maintain their kind of personal conscientiousness, if you will, in that job role? So once we select someone, we're wanting to make sure that we select the right people, but once they're in the organization, we kind of want to establish an environment that successfully motivates someone, that allows motivation to allow that effort and maintenance part of performance in the job. So we're going to be talking about performance as how we motivate performance. And there's a couple of theories, and we're going to be going over them, and each theory is mainly set up in a way to illustrate kind of what areas or where are the levers again. The idea of when we're trying to motivate someone, what are the elements that we can change or affect in an organization to allow us to motivate people better? So when we're talking about motivation from an organizational viewpoint, there's a couple things we're interested in. What is motivation, but also how can we affect it? How can we set up an environment that makes motivation more likely to occur naturally? And how can we directly motivate employees to do better? So it's a very natural tie-in because it ties from the job analysis, performance, and predictors, but it also basically is picking up from there. So if you have a job analysis that says this is what performance is, you have a performance appraisal system where you're measuring performance, and you have a selection system that gets qualified applicants into the job, motivation is the next key component. How do you motivate those people to do the skills, to use the knowledge necessary for them to perform very well? So let's talk about organizational psychology. So organizational psychology historically came after personnel psychology. So there is some historical kind of precedence to how this occurred. And that again, the focus initially was much more on the hard decision making in organizations. And that makes a lot of sense when you think that at the same time that industrial psychology or personnel psychology was getting its groundings, if you will, was the same time where we had scientific management and classic organizational theory and kind of theory X, where the entire idea was just get the right people that can do the job and then make them do it. Well, the human relations movement in the business world, this idea that people matter and people should be treated fairly and justly and well, also was then seen in kind of personnel psychology, kind of bringing about the formation of organizational psychology. So let's look at the definition. A systematic study of the dispositional and situational variables that influence the behaviors and experiences of individuals and groups at work. So as always, we've got a pretty packed up definition there. Systematic study. So we're still drawing the scientific method of empiricism and determinism. The best way to observe it, the best way to learn about organizational psychology is to observe it systematically, and we're expecting that there's a causal and effect deterministic outcome. That if we change various elements in the workplace, it can result in improvement in the factors of what we're looking at, or the outcomes. Dispositional and situational variables. What this says is how the person feels, their disposition. So are they do they have a positive attitude? Do they have a negative attitude? That affects or influences what happens in the workplace, but also the situation itself, situational variables, the way the organization is set up. Both of these can influence behaviors and experiences of individuals and groups at work. So the attitudes of people and the situations or the structure of work will influence behaviors and the attitudes and experiences of both individuals and groups at work. In other words, again, just a very strong focus on the idea of the human factor, the human part of the business world. Very much focused on the throughputs and how people are going to behave differently based on their attitudes and based on the situation. So topics in organizational psychology include motivation, which we're going to talk about today, job attitudes, so basically a disposition, how people feel about their jobs, stress and worker well-being, so the impact of being in a stressful job or an emotionally stressful job, group processes and work teams, so what we know about how to increase the likelihood that a group will actually perform well, leadership, so above and beyond the theories of motivation, how can people actually be seen as leaders? Who is a good leader? How do we select leaders? And how can leaders better directly motivate people? And finally, something we've already been talking about, the idea of organizational theory and development, that broad picture. So all of this falls into the side of OSI. So let's talk about work motivation a little then. So with all constructs in industrial organizational psychology, the first thing we need to do is define what that construct is. So when we're talking about work motivation, we need to have a definition that differentiates it from other things we're measuring in the workplace. So what makes motivation different than organizational commitment or job satisfaction or performance for that matter? So here's our definition. It's a force that drives people to behave in a way that energizes, directs, and sustains their work behavior. So the force part basically illustrates that motivation can come from different areas. That motivation can be internal, it can be external, but it is something that is acting on the person. So it may be that they're internally motivated, that there's an internal drive for them to behave in a way. It may be an external force. So they may be motivated by threats. They may be motivated by requests. They may be motivated by a feeling of obligation. There's a lot of different things that can basically result in motivation. And that's why that first word is in there, force. It is some type of pressure that drives people to behave. So it drives people to behave. That means it's causing behavior. And for it to be motivation, that behavior is energized, directed, and sustained, and it's focused on work behavior. And that's why our definition is for work motivation. So if we look at the energize, directs, and sustains, energizing and direct pretty much locks on to Campbell's job analysis key job components of effort. So energizing results in the expenditure of effort, and directs effort channels that effort towards a particular object in place. So this is what Campbell would refer to as simply effort, that all jobs require us to put energy and time into actually attaining work-specific goals, job-specific goals. So work motivation is going to be behavior that energizes. In other words, it results in someone being willing to expend that effort, and that effort is being directed towards a particular object or place, i.e., hopefully, job-relevant tasks. Now, the sustaining effort over a period of time locks on to Campbell's job analysis area of maintenance. Again, that idea that it's not just enough to put in effort. We need to put in effort over a consistent period of time with a consistent amount of conscientiousness. So, work motivation is that energizing, directed effort that is sustained over a long period of time. Motivation and performance are not the same constructs. So motivation results in performance. It is a cause of performance. It is something that increases or decreases performance. So if you have low motivation, you may, in certain situations, have lower performance. But sometimes the situation will not allow that to happen. So you can have someone that is highly unmotivated. They have no drive to behave in a way that actually energizes, directs, or sustains their work behavior at all. But they have a job that requires them to do X amount of things an hour, and if they don't, they get fired. Now, you could say that might be a motivator. That's what's motivating them. But by most measures of motivation, we would find that person fairly unmotivated. However, their performance might still be adequate. So motivation and performance are not always 100% related. You can have someone that's highly motivated but doesn't have the skills and knowledge necessary to do the job well. They'll have poor performance. And you can have someone with great knowledge and skills but poor motivation that also is not performing well. So if you have the knowledge and skills to begin with and you're motivated, you are more likely to perform well. But motivation is a separate part of the puzzle. So there's three major categories of motivation theories. And these are drawn from all the disciplines in psychology, but they basically ask one key question. And the question that we want to ask is, how can we apply these theories with utility in an organization? So basically, is it a theory that we can apply to an organization that management will endorse, that people will understand, and will actually have an effect on increasing the organizational goals, usually performance? So these motivational theories come from clinical and personality psychology, cognitive psychology, social psychology, and some of them have been actually created by industrial organizational psychologists. And they provide useful frameworks in order for us to kind of think about the relationship and the interaction between motivators, things, the force in that definition of motivation. So what is causing the person to actually be energized, directed, and sustained? But also the environment that's occurring around that motivation and how the environment itself can cause motivation, and the person themselves and how they are reacting to the being motivated. So when we look at these, we have need, motive, value theories. It emphasizes the role of personality traits, stable dispositions, needs, and values. So need, motive, value theories basically say that one of the things that can motivate us is our needs. And those needs can come from personality traits, stable dispositions, but also more physical needs and values. And basically what this says is these theories are focused on find out what most people need. So do they need to belong? Do they need resources? Do they need safety and comfort? Provide those needs and they'll be more motivated. If nothing else, they'll be motivated not to lose those needs. So need, motive, value theory often says a fair pay is motivating because someone doesn't want to lose that pay, because if they lose that pay, they lose security, they lose access to things that they need. Cognitive choice theory is the assumption here is that people are active decision makers who strive to be rational in choosing what to do and how much effort to exert. So cognitive choice theories basically suggest that you want to design jobs and environments to where it's the logical choice to perform well. So these are basically, again, kind of cognitive, rational theories. And the problem with rational theories is that we don't always behave rationally. And finally, there's self-regulation theories, manner in which individuals monitor their own behavior and make adjustments to those behaviors in pursuit of the goals. So self-regulation theories are the theories that say if you have someone that is internally motivated, how do you make sure you're setting up a job in which way that they'll self-motivate themselves to do better? So let's go ahead and discuss each and see how they can be applied to organizations. So the most famous need, motive, value theory is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the idea here is that Maslow suggested that each person, regardless of who they are individually, is driven by a hierarchy of needs. So the first one is physiological, that we need food, we need air, we need water. Some arguments might say we need reproduction. The next level is that we need safety. So once those basic needs of food and water are sustained, the next thing is we want to feel safe. We want to have a cave over our head, so to speak. We want to be able to get out of the rain. We want to be able to stay warm. And we want to not have to worry about being eaten by various animals. at the very basic level. If we have our safety needs and our physiological needs met, then we want our basically social needs. We want to be socially belong, we want to be loved, we want to have friends, we want to have social interactions. Once we have those needs met, now we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to have self-esteem. We want to feel pride in what we do and the relationships and organizations that we're in. And finally, if we're feeling good about ourselves, if we have a strong social network, if we're feeling safe and our physiological needs are all met, that's when we start to think about self-improvement and self-motivation. So basically, by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he suggests that if you go into a situation where you're trying to have people self-motivate, in other words, kind of the top of the pyramid, and they're in a dangerous situation where they're just worried about their safety, and that safety may not be fear of tigers, that safety may also be it's an unstable economy and they're unsure if the company will be around in 2 or 3 weeks. Maslow would suggest that attempts to self-actualize or self-motivate are probably going to fail at that level. If you want to motivate people, you need to address the level they're on, and at that moment, they would be focused on the safety level. So you'd need to come up with assurances. You do well, you're going to stay with this company. Addifer brought this down to the ERG theory, trying to make this a little bit more usable in organizations. So he basically brought these 5 levels into 3 levels. Existence needs, which basically cover psychological or physiological and safety needs together. Relatedness needs, this is love, social needs, and then he put growth needs, esteem, and self-actualization together. And again, both of these theories kind of suggest the idea that you need to determine where your employees are on their level of needs. And you need to make sure that you're going up the pyramid. So if you've got people that aren't making enough money to be able to get enough food or safety, then any attempt to give them praise, to give them social interactions, is not going to motivate them well. They need more money. And at that point, money is probably your best motivator. If they have enough money where they now feel safe and they now feel like their basic needs are being met, that's when you can start looking at more social and kind of organizational interventions. Increase their job satisfaction, increase how people interact at work. So these are all theories about first actually basically measuring the environment. You want to be able to figure out where are my employees at in this needs, motive, value pyramid so that I can decide what kind of interventions I need to use to motivate people. A third theory that falls into this area, again trying to make it more usable in organizations, and notice I keep saying more usable in organizations. That's because Maslow's hierarchy of needs is not well supported by organizational research. In other words, this theory is a good way to kind of think about things broadly. People can recognize it. You can kind of talk about this more as like a continuous spectrum of talking to a manager going, you need to make sure that people are getting all of these needs met. Are they physiologically safe? Are physiological needs being met? Are their safety needs being met? Are their social needs being met? Are their personal self-esteem needs being met? And finally, are they being allowed to develop and grow? If you address all of these, you're more likely to get a motivated employee, and that is true. But if you try to actually look at this from an organizational viewpoint of, okay, this particular group should be influenced by social motivators right now, a lot of times you don't find as good support for this theory there. Addifer's ERG theory not only tried to simplify this a little bit, he also basically suggested that you need to be addressing all 3 needs. So unlike Maslow, who basically said we go through these stages, and whatever stage you're at, that's the stage that you need to be motivated at, which has not been supported in organizations. Addifer's theory was a little bit more broad. It basically said you need to address all of these if you want to motivate someone. Again, however, when we actually tried to take this into the workplace and study it, in other words, use this theory to come up with motivational techniques and then see if it really worked as predicted, not a whole lot of support. So Herzberg's 2-factor theory is again trying to get this kind of broad need, motive, value theory into the workplace. He suggests that there's 2 kind of factors that we need to worry about. Motivators, which are we satisfied and motivated by the job? And this is kind of the top end of the pyramid. This is this love, esteem, and self-actualization. Or hygienes related to job context, salary, working conditions, and supervisions. So what he suggested is the bottom of the pyramid are hygienes, and the top of the pyramid is motivators. And the idea here is that hygienes, if they're not there, will result in job dissatisfaction. In other words, if you aren't getting those basic needs met, it's not that these basic needs motivate you. It's that if they're not being met, you're not even thinking about working at that point. You're recognizing you basically have a bad job. Once the hygienes are met, that's when you can start talking about motivators and motivating someone to go above and beyond. So Herzberg's two-factor theory has found a little bit more support when we've actually brought it into the workplace to use. So it basically says that the determinants of job satisfaction are different than those of job dissatisfaction. In other words, if you motivate someone, which is the motivators, that leads employees to be satisfied and motivated by their job, giving them recognition, giving them interesting work, allowing them to develop. You do those things and you're going to get higher job satisfaction. It's going to increase job satisfaction, and you're also going to see more motivation. Conversely, if someone has low hygienes, the job context, their salary is low, their working conditions are unsafe, the supervision is bad, at that point, that actually isn't related to job satisfaction. In other words, giving someone a decent salary, decent working conditions, and decent supervision will rarely result in a massive increase in job satisfaction or more motivation. It's basically the baseline expectations. If I take this job, you're going to pay me a fair wage, it's going to be a safe working environment, and I'm going to get decent supervision. When these things are lacking is when you find job dissatisfaction. In other words, they predict negative reactions, not positive reactions. So the presence of hygienes results in only minimal levels of satisfaction. They're basically what we expect from any job. Dissatisfaction results from not having these hygienes. True satisfaction only results from having motivators placed on top of the hygienes already being addressed. So again, empirical studies have been mixed for the two-factor theory. It doesn't explain all motivation. It doesn't always work in every organization. But there is more support for this theory compared to the others as far as actually being mappable and testable in organizations. So just an overview of the need theories. We've got 3 need theories that are fairly similar, and they're basically playing around with the same ideas. They're just categorizing them differently, and they're also kind of expecting how they function in the workplace to be a little different. So in the middle, we have the initial one, the grandfather, if you will, Maslow's need hierarchy. 5 levels, all the way from physiological safety to full self-actualization. Not originally necessarily intended as an organizational theory, but adapted by IO psychologists. A great way to communicate about the need for addressing multiple things when you're trying to talk about how to motivate someone, but not necessarily well supported in organizations. And also by Maslow's need hierarchy, this is a very hierarchical model. According to Maslow, you have to be, all the previous levels have to be satisfied before you're worried about the current level. So if the only thing that you're satisfied on is physiological safety or physiological needs, then esteem and self-actualization and love aren't going to affect you. You want safety next. Addifer's ERG theory breaks these into 3 broader categories, puts self-actualization and esteem all into a kind of a growth category, the social aspects all into a relatedness category, and the safety and physiological all into an existence category, and also suggests that they can operate independently. That technically you could have a situation where someone is in very low existence needs. In other words, they are starving, they're hungry, they don't feel very safe, but they're in a great social environment and they're being allowed to grow, so they're willing to tolerate, for example, that very low pay. And sometimes you will find this in an organization. Now again, when we try to apply this to actually making models that allow us to consistently increase motivation, not a whole lot of support. And finally, we have Herzberg's 2 factors theory, breaks it even further into 2 broad categories. Hygienes basically are basic assumptions of what every job should include, and therefore when we get them, we really don't give much credit to the organization. Yay, you're paying me what I should be paid, and you're not throwing me into a dangerous situation. I'm not going to give you a lot of credit for that. That doesn't motivate me. That basically just says I'm going to keep this job and not leave. Motivators stack on top of those hygienes. Once the hygienes are satisfied, then motivators are allowed to actually increase job satisfaction and therefore also motivation. So job characteristic theory is what we're going to talk about next. So job characteristics theory is making a jump, if you will, All the previous theories we were talking about were kind of about external motivation. In other words, provide someone an external source, a job or a manager, is providing motivators. It's providing physiological needs, it's providing safety needs, it's providing social needs, it's providing self-esteem needs, it's providing developmental or self-actualization needs. Job characteristic theory is more of an intrinsic or internal motivation theory. So this includes kind of personality differences, types of work that we're going to do, and what outcomes are valued. So Hackman and Oldman in 1980 argued that motivation is determined by the joint effects of the individual differences in personality and the characteristics of the job. In other words, he was saying that each individual brings their own internal motivators with them to a job based on their personality, that some people are very motivated just naturally, some people are not. And then the characteristics of the job interact with that personality to determine if someone is going to be internally motivated. In other words, this is more of a situational theory. He believed that there was core job dimensions, so there was core traits in jobs that you could adjust or change to change the likelihood of someone being motivated or not. There was critical psychological states, so again, how those core job dimensions translated into how people felt about their jobs, which then resulted in personal and work outcomes, basically performance. So you set up the job to have the right dimensions to result in the right attitudes in the people that have the job. You'll naturally get motivation, and that motivation will result in performance. The 5 core job dimensions were skill variety, so the number of skills that you use in your job, task identity, how clear it was to determine what tasks you were supposed to do, task significance, how easy is it for you to tell that your tasks are related to the broader organizational picture, autonomy, so how much control you have over your job, and finally feedback, the amount of feedback that you're actually getting on the job as a part of your oversight or management. So as I said, this is a theory of intrinsic motivation, mainly due to the emphasis on kind of personal mastery and control. This is about giving people control. So when you look at those core job dimensions, skill variety, so you're making a job more interesting. Task identity, you're making it clear what the job is actually entailing. Your task significance, you're letting people see how important their tasks are. And autonomy and feedback, you're letting people have choices and control of the job that they do, and you're giving them good feedback to allow them to develop. Basically, you're creating a job that naturally gives someone a lot of those motivators or motivations that we were talking about in the previous theories. So here's kind of what the job characteristic model looks like, and again, this gives us some information about things that we can change in an organization to hopefully result in higher motivation and therefore higher performance. So again, our core job dimensions, the skill variety, the task identity, and the task significance all lead to experienced meaningfulness. So that's the critical psychological state. So on the far left there, we have our core job dimensions. In the middle, we have the psychological states. And on the right, in the purple, we have the actual outcomes. So basically, if we have a job that has a lot of variety, but the tasks that are done in the job are clearly defined, and you can tell that those tasks will result in the organization's success, that results in critical psychological state of experienced meaningfulness. It also results in growth needs strength. So growth needs strength is kind of the individual value. So this is kind of a part of the theory that says that the individual is also going to affect those critical states. So if someone has a high need for growth, they're going to want more experience meaningfulness, they're going to want more experience responsibility, and they're going to want more knowledge and results because they want to grow. If someone has low growth need strengths, in an individual personality trait, then this model will actually work less on them because they're not as interested in experience meaningfulness, experience responsibility, and knowledge results. Autonomy results in experience responsibility. Feedback results in knowledge of results. So if you're getting feedback, you know whether you're succeeding or not. If you have autonomy, you experience responsibility for your own job. And finally, if you have a varied job that you know what the job entails and you know how that job fits with the rest of the organization, you can experience meaningfulness. When you have all of these, you then tend to have high internal motivation, high quality of work performance, generally highly satisfied with the work, and we find lower absenteeism and turnover. So the other neat thing about job characteristic model is this is a testable model. We can actually vary the core job dimensions, measure the critical psychological states, and then look at the personal work outcomes to find out if there's support for this model. Notice also that the personal and work outcomes, one of them is high quality work performance, but the other ones also are related to performance. So having a high internal motivation, that's again a force that drives performance. High satisfaction with the work, the more you like the job, the more likely you're also going to perform. And finally, lower absenteeism and turnover, so less likely to leave the job and more likely to be there when you're supposed to be there, which would of course also result in higher performance. So there's other intrinsic motivation theories, and again, intrinsic motivation theories are those theories that are focused on internal motivation. There's cognitive evaluation theory, DESE in 1975. Basically, individuals adopt either an intrinsic or external motivation orientation. This basically says that we need to first determine, if we're wanting to motivate someone, to determine are they motivated by external motivators or are they motivated by internal motivators. And if what they're motivated by is one or the other, if we use the wrong type of motivators, we're not going to get as much effect, basically. So then there's self-determination theory. This is an expansion on cognitive evaluation theory, DESE and Ryan in 2000. Basically, the social contextual events, in other words, the reception of feedback and rewards, that enhance perceptions of competence improve intrinsic motivation. So, in other words, what we're wanting to do is how people perceive their rewards and feedback will actually result in them feeling more competent, which then results in them being more motivated. So, let's talk about each one of these a little bit more in turn. So cognitive evaluation theory is basically the theory that's saying it does depend on the person. What's inside the person is basically, it's a person environment fit model that we want to match the person, in this case, whether they're intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. Intrinsic means internally motivated. Extrinsic means externally motivated. And that we want to match that knowledge with the type of motivation we use with that person. So someone highly motivated by extrinsic external rewards is going to be basically rewarded by a lot of praise, a lot of rewards, a lot of bonuses. So that's what's going to get that person to work harder. However, if you tried to basically create a job that would naturally, so if we used the previous model we were just talking about, if you actually tried to apply the job characteristic model, which is all about just setting up a job to naturally result in you being more motivated, someone that's high in extrinsic external motivation is not going to react well to that model. In fact, within that model, they would probably have low growth need strength. The model, the job characteristic model, is going to work well, though, on people that actually are fairly intrinsically motivated. That if you give them the right environment, they're going to just self-motivate. Now, self-determination theory is more about how that feedback and the feedback and social events of the feedback are perceived as motivating. So basically, again, it recognizes that when you provide a motivator, when you do something in an organization to motivate someone, you need to determine the type of motivation and how it's going to be received by the person, again, based on whether they are intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. So when you provide external rewards, it can also have a positive effect on extrinsic people, but can actually backfire on intrinsic people. And this is what we refer to as the over-justification effect. When you provide external reinforcement, it tends to reduce intrinsic motivation. So if you have people that are highly intrinsically motivated and then you put in an external set of reinforcers, what often is going to happen is they're going to shift and start to expect that external reinforcement. And if that external reinforcement goes away, they'll actually reduce their performance at that point. So external reinforcement works very well with people that are externally motivated, but it actually tends to be poor and actually can cause a reduction in performance if it's instigated with people that are high in intrinsic motivation. So there's a fairly common story that's told that illustrates the over-justification effect. There was an older gentleman who lived in the city that basically lived alone in a house. And every afternoon when school got out, a bunch of loud and boisterous kids would come onto his front lawn and play. And he'd go out and yell at them to tell him to get off his lawn and to move on. And they ignored him and refused. One day, he actually went out and said, you know what? I'm done yelling at you. I've decided I actually like you coming out here and playing in my lawn because it keeps other people away. So I'm going to actually reward you. I'm going to give you a quarter each for coming and playing." And he immediately handed each one of them 1 quarter for coming out and playing on his lawn. So for a couple of days, he came out every day and gave him a quarter. After a little while, he came back out the next day and said, "You know, I'm sorry. I know I've been giving you a quarter, and I really love having you guys out on my lawn, but I just can't afford a quarter anymore. I don't have much money, so I'm going to have to go down to a dime." Well, they kind of grumbled, but still they took the dime, and so for the next couple of days, he gave him a dime every time they came out after school and hung out on his lawn playing. Then he came out and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, but even a dime's starting to break me. There's so many of you. I'm going to have to go down to a nickel." At this point, the kids really grumbled, and one of them said, "Man, for 1 nickel, we're not going to do anything for a nickel. We're not coming back." And they all left and never came back to play on his lawn. That is an example of over-justification effect. The kids were internally motivated to play on that lawn whenever, and they weren't having to be paid anything for it. The old man instigated an external reinforcement and established that that's why they were doing it. And once he stopped giving that external reinforcement, they were no longer interested in doing the behavior. Now, this is kind of just a funny story. It's kind of interesting, but it is supported by science. Research has found that when you actually put in external reinforcement, specifically pay or bonuses, to people that are intrinsically motivated, they will continue performing just as they had before, but they'll shift the reason they're performing from their intrinsic motivation, "I do this because I love my job," to an external motivation, "I do this because I get bonuses." And if those bonuses go away, it's going to take a little while for intrinsic motivations to come back.